So Donald Trump thought capturing Nicolas Maduro would end the Venezuela problem with a clean military victory. It's honestly hard to believe anyone in the Pentagon actually thought this would work out cleanly, because military analysts are now warning that Trump just walked the United States into what could become the most dangerous insurgency American forces have faced since Afghanistan. We're talking about an estimated 60,000 trained fighters prepared for guerrilla warfare, tens of thousands of heavily armed political militias, controlling entire neighborhoods in Caracas, Colombian guerrilla forces with decades of combat experience stating their LL fight any U.S. occupation, and a Venezuelan military that has spent years planning exactly how to turn this country into an ungovernable nightmare for American troops. Trump captured one dictator, but he just triggered the conditions for a protracted guerrilla war that could make Iraq and Afghanistan look like warm-up exercises. Let me fill you in on what military experts are saying about the threat Trump's forces are actually facing. Within hours of the operation, retired Air Force Colonel Cedric Layton, a CNN military analyst with extensive intelligence experience, issued a stark warning. He told CNN that deploying U.S. troops in Venezuela could become a force protection nightmare. According to Layton, the Venezuelan military has had plans for years that indicate it would engage in guerrilla warfare if invaded. An insurgency would involve Venezuelan forces melting back into the hills or hiding in city slums while attacking U.S. troops. Layton emphasized that if this isn't handled carefully and if governance isn't put in place properly, American forces face extreme danger, and the risk with Venezuela, he explained, is that it could be a hostile environment that puts U.S. forces in great peril. These aren't just theoretical concerns. This is a military analyst with decades of experience in exactly these types of operations warning that Trump has created the conditions for sustained asymmetric warfare against American personnel. The scale of the potential threat is absolutely staggering. Venezuelan government sources told Reuters that they estimate roughly 60,000 soldiers and National Guardsmen could be fielded for sustained guerrilla warfare operations. That's not 60,000 conventional troops lined up for American air power to destroy. That's 60,000 fighters trained and equipped to blend into the population, conduct ambushes, plant improvised explosive devices, and wage the kind of hit-and-run warfare that slowly bleeds occupying forces over years. But here's where things get really alarming. Those 60,000 Venezuelan military personnel are just the beginning. Venezuela has developed one of the most extensive paramilitary networks in Latin America specifically designed to resist foreign intervention. At the center of this network are the colectivos, armed political militias that have been operating for over 2 decades. The colectivos emerged after the 2002 coup attempt against Hugo Chavez, when the government began providing community groups with weapons and resources. Over the past 20 years, these groups evolved from community organizations into heavily armed paramilitary forces. They're concentrated strongest in Caracas, where neighborhoods like 23 de Enero host some of the country's most established militia structures. Groups like La Piedrita, Tres Anillas, Oswaldo Arenas, and Alexis 5 operate as de facto authorities in their territories. According to research from Insight Crime, colectivos are present in at least 10 Venezuelan states and many major urban centers. They have their own weapons caches, their own command structures, and years of experience conducting violent operations against opponents of the government. Human Rights Watch described them as armed gangs who use violence with impunity. An Organization of American States report documented that collectivos murdered at least 131 individuals between 2014 and 2017 during anti-government protests alone. The New York Times specifically warned that if Venezuela comes under control of a leader or foreign occupier opposed to Chavismo, the colectivos could turn Caracas into a deadly theater for urban guerrilla warfare, in which combatants find refuge in the city's hilly topography and abandoned high-rises. Think about that for a moment. Tens of thousands of armed fighters who know every alley, every rooftop, every hiding spot in a massive sprawling city conducting ambushes against American patrols. That's not a military problem with a clean solution. That's an urban nightmare. Then there's the DGCIM, Venezuela's military intelligence directorate that functions like a Praetorian Guard. The Financial Times reported that the DGCIM has access to rifles, launchers, grenades, M2 machine guns, and light armored vehicles. Central to any prolonged resistance would be the DGCIM. which could merge with militias for sustained urban guerrilla warfare. These aren't poorly trained amateurs. These are intelligence operatives with heavy weapons who have spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. And we can't forget the Colombian guerrillas operating extensively in Venezuelan territory. The ELN, National Liberation Army, has been designated a terrorist organization by the United States since 1997. This group now has an estimated 6,450 fighters operating in both Colombia and Venezuela, plus a larger unknown number of support personnel. The ELN has decades of experience with guerrilla warfare tactics, bombing campaigns, kidnappings, and asymmetric operations against superior conventional forces. Here's the thing that should terrify Pentagon planners. An ELN commander in the Catatumbo border region told Al Jazeera explicitly that if Trump attacks Venezuela, they will have to see how they respond. But it's not just them. The commander predicted that all of Latin America would mobilize, with many people grabbing weapons to fight because U.S. disrespect for self-determination has to end. The ELN's criminal capacity, territorial control, and combat experience make them a formidable opponent. They control strategic border regions, run extensive drug trafficking and illegal mining operations, and have political affinity with Chavista ideology. The guerrillas have been providing training to Venezuelan armed groups for years. FARC computers confiscated back in 2011 revealed that Colombian guerrillas provided military training to hundreds of members of various Venezuelan paramilitary organizations. These fighters know how to conduct ambushes, plant IEDs, run criminal networks to fund operations, and sustain insurgencies across years or decades. They watched what insurgents did to American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they've been preparing to apply those lessons if the United States ever invaded Venezuela. Now, this isn't the first time American military planners have underestimated insurgent threats before launching regime change operations. The pattern is painfully familiar to anyone who lived through Iraq and Afghanistan. We've seen this disaster unfold before, and we're watching the same miscalculations happen again. Just think about Iraq. The Bush administration invaded in 2003 with overwhelming conventional military superiority, quickly toppled Saddam Hussein's government, and declared major combat operations over within weeks. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld infamously predicted that the Iraq War would last 6 days, 6 weeks, or maybe 6 months, but certainly not longer. The actual occupation lasted 8 years of sustained combat, cost over 4,000 American lives, killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, and cost American taxpayers over $2 trillion. The Iraqi insurgency caught American forces completely unprepared despite clear warnings from military analysts. When Paul Bremer dissolved the Iraqi army, he put hundreds of thousands of trained soldiers out of work with no prospects and had plenty of weapons, and those disbanded forces gravitated toward insurgent groups and militias. Al-Qaeda in Iraq recruited heavily from former military personnel who knew tactics, weapons, and had axes to grind against the occupying Americans. The insurgency evolved into a brutal sectarian civil war that tore the country apart. Then there was Afghanistan, America's longest war. The United States invaded in 2001, quickly toppled the Taliban government with special forces and air power, and assumed the hard part was over. 20 years later, after spending over $2 trillion and losing over 2,000 American lives, the Taliban retook the entire country within weeks of U.S. withdrawal. 2 decades of nation-building, training Afghan security forces, and trying to establish stable governance achieved essentially nothing permanent. The Afghanistan disaster happened because occupying powers can never fully control territory in a sustained insurgency. The Taliban melted into Pakistan and rural Afghanistan, waged asymmetric warfare, waited out American political will, and knew that time was on their side. No matter how much firepower the United States deployed, insurgents only needed to survive and occasionally kill Americans to make the occupation unsustainable over time. And let's not forget Vietnam, the original template for how a determined insurgency defeats a technologically superior military power. The United States deployed over 500,000 troops, dropped more bombs than all of World War II, and still lost to Viet Cong guerrillas and North Vietnamese forces fighting on their home territory, with intimate knowledge of terrain and political support from significant portions of the population. The lesson from every one of these conflicts is crystal clear. Conventional military dominance doesn't translate into successful occupation against determined guerrilla resistance. You can win every major battle and still lose the war when insurgents make occupation too costly to sustain politically. American voters eventually demand withdrawal when casualties mount, costs explode, and no clear victory appears achievable. Now, Venezuela has studied all these cases intensively and built its resistance strategy around the lessons learned. Venezuelan military sources told Reuters bluntly that we wouldn't last 2 hours in a conventional war against the United States. That's why they're not planning conventional warfare. They're planning exactly the kind of protracted guerrilla campaign that bled America in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Vietnam. The Venezuelan government has developed detailed plans called Plan Independencia 200 that envision dispersed units waging sabotage and ambushes across more than 280 mapped locations if U.S. forces occupy the country. These aren't abstract contingency plans gathering dust in a filing cabinet. This is active preparation involving weapons distribution, militia training, and coordination with guerrilla forces. Even more concerning is what defense analysts call the anarchization strategy. This involves deliberately fomenting disorder in Caracas and other cities, mobilizing intelligence networks and armed party loyalists to render the capital ungovernable for any occupying force. The goal isn't to defeat American military units in direct combat. The goal is to make Venezuela impossible to govern, too dangerous for reconstruction efforts, and so chaotic that no political transition can succeed. Think about what that means operationally. American troops trying to secure Caracas would face constant ambushes from fighters who disappear into slums built on hillsides. Engineers attempting to rebuild oil infrastructure would need massive security details because of sabotage threats. Diplomats trying to establish transitional government would operate under siege conditions. Aid workers attempting to deliver humanitarian assistance would be targeted to create disorder and humanitarian crisis that undermines U.S. legitimacy. This strategy worked devastatingly well against the United States in Iraq. Insurgents didn't need to destroy American military units, they just needed to blow up pipelines, assassinate Iraqi officials cooperating with Americans, conduct bombing campaigns that killed civilians, and created sectarian violence and make reconstruction impossible. Every day that Iraq remained chaotic and violent was a propaganda victory for insurgents and a political problem for American leaders trying to justify the occupation. Venezuela is perfectly positioned to execute this strategy even more effectively than Iraq ever was. The collectivos already control territory throughout Caracas and other major cities. They know every neighborhood intimately, have extensive criminal networks for funding and weapons, and have years of experience operating violently with impunity. The ELN and other guerrilla forces control border regions and rural areas, providing external support and refuge for fighters. Venezuelan intelligence services have lists of everyone who might cooperate with Americans and the capability to target them systematically. The terrain itself favors guerrilla warfare. Venezuela has dense urban areas perfect for ambushes, mountainous regions where conventional forces struggle, an extensive jungle in the south, and porous borders with Colombia that make resupply and external support almost impossible to interdict. Venezuela is larger than Texas and New Mexico combined, with only 15,000 U.S. troops currently in the region. By comparison, the United States deployed hundreds of thousands of troops to Iraq and Afghanistan, and those occupations still failed. So, what's Trump's plan for dealing with this nightmare scenario? Well, it all boils down to magical thinking and hoping problems go away if you ignore them long enough. Trump announced the United States would run Venezuela until a proper transition occurs, but provided zero details about timelines, benchmarks, governance structures, or how to deal with inevitable insurgent resistance. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has tried walking back Trump's statements about running the country, suggesting instead that the United States will use an oil quarantine to exercise control rather than direct occupation, but that just creates different problems. An oil quarantine means Venezuelan economic collapse continues. Ordinary Venezuelans suffer massive humanitarian crisis, and resentment toward the United States becomes the unifying political force that sustains resistance movements. The Pentagon currently has 15,000 troops in the Caribbean region. Military analysts point out that's a fraction of what would be needed for actual occupation and counterinsurgency operations. Iraq required over 160,000 troops at peak, and Afghanistan required a similar number. Venezuela has twice Iraq's population and far more extensive paramilitary infrastructure specifically designed to resist occupation. But here's where things started to go catastrophically wrong from a military planning perspective. According to reporting from multiple sources, the Trump administration launched this operation with insufficient planning, unclear objectives, lack of diplomatic capacity in country, and unrealistic timelines. Chatham House experts noted that insufficient planning, unclear and conflicting objectives, lack of U.S. diplomatic capacity in country, limited attention, and unrealistic timelines plagued early U.S. efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Trump is repeating the same mistakes. The operation already resulted in 32 Cuban military personnel killed. During the strikes, Cuba announced that these individuals were serving missions on behalf of Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces and Ministry of the Interior at the request of Venezuelan counterparts. The Cubans fell after fierce resistance in direct combat against attackers or as a result of bombing. That's not a clean operation. That's sustained fighting that produced dozens of casualties from just one ally supporting Venezuela. Imagine what happens when tens of thousands of Venezuelan fighters launch coordinated resistance. This whole situation is creating exactly the conditions for protracted guerrilla warfare that bleeds American forces. If Trump commits substantial troops to actually occupy and govern Venezuela, those forces face daily ambushes, IED attacks, sniper fire, and asymmetric operations that produce steady American casualties. Each death undermines political support back home. Each attack demonstrates that the United States cannot actually control the country, despite overwhelming military superiority. If Trump instead tries to govern through proxies while maintaining minimal U.S. presence, then Venezuelan resistance fighters systematically target anyone cooperating with Americans. The transitional government becomes impossible to staff because accepting a position means you and your family become targets. Reconstruction efforts fail because contractors won't work in hostile environments. Oil infrastructure stays damaged because sabotage makes repairs impossible to sustain. The economic costs spiral out of control either way. Direct occupation costs billions monthly just for force protection and basic operations before even attempting reconstruction. Governing through proxies means endless emergency aid packages, security assistance, and bailouts for a Venezuelan economy that continues cratering. Both options require sustained appropriations from Congress over years or decades with no clear endpoint or definition of success. Intelligence analysts note that the conditions are ripe for protracted, low-intensity warfare, even if the armed forces remain united post-Maduro. A long-standing analyst in Caracas told Insight Crime that Venezuela is packed with armed groups invested in the status quo. These groups won't evaporate just because Maduro is gone. They have territorial control, criminal revenue streams, weapons caches, and political motivation to resist any government that threatens their power and profits. The colectivos in particular won't disappear. For years, these groups have fused political activism with criminal enterprise, anchoring themselves in neighborhoods where they've established themselves as de facto authorities. Their territorial control, financial streams from drug trafficking and extortion, and loyal social bases make it certain they'll remain entrenched players that any future government has to contend with. And if that future government is backed by the United States, the colectivos become resistance fighters waging urban guerrilla warfare. Several factors make Venezuela potentially worse than Iraq or Afghanistan for American forces. Iraq had some functional state institutions that could be rebuilt. Afghanistan had regional warlords who could be negotiated with and co-opted. Venezuela has spent 25 years deliberately eroding military hierarchy, creating parallel power structures specifically designed to resist centralized authority, and building paramilitary networks that don't answer to conventional chains of command. The Venezuelan military itself is fractured and unreliable. 25 years of Chavista leadership installed loyalists based on political reliability rather than competence, bloated the officer corps with corruption, and allowed Cuban intelligence officers to monitor the entire structure. Junior officers and enlisted personnel are paid roughly $100 monthly when basic food costs $500. Desertion rates were high even before the U.S. invasion. These aren't forces that will cooperate with American occupation. A Council on Foreign Relations analysis noted that Venezuela's military doesn't have a monopoly on force. It coexists alongside repressive secret police, armed neighborhood militias, and factions of Colombian guerrilla groups. Any of these elements could initiate resistance independently. There's no single power center to negotiate with or coerce into cooperation. The fragmentation means insurgent activity will be decentralized, harder to predict, and impossible to stop by capturing or killing leadership. The political dynamics make sustainable transition nearly impossible. Venezuela's democratic opposition has strong legitimacy, with polls suggesting support from roughly 80% of the population. But the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, is out of the country, and Trump insulted her during his press conference, while indicating he's been in contact with Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. If Trump backs regime remnants instead of the democratic opposition, resistance will come from both Chavista loyalists, angry about Maduro's capture, and opposition supporters betrayed by American support for continued dictatorship. So let's break down what this disaster means for American security and political stability, because it's not just a foreign policy problem. It has direct consequences for military readiness, defense, budgets, political sustainability, and America's ability to address actual threats to national interests. First up is the military readiness nightmare. If the United States commits substantial forces to counterinsurgency operations in Venezuela, those troops aren't available for deterring China in the Pacific, supporting NATO against Russia in Europe, or responding to crises in the Middle East. The U.S. military is already stretched thin. Iraq and Afghanistan demonstrated that sustained occupations degrade equipment, burn out personnel, and consume resources that can't be used elsewhere. Venezuela would be a third simultaneous commitment requiring force rotations, equipment replacement, and budget increases. The Pentagon is already expressing concerns about exactly this problem. General Dan Kane told reporters that American forces remain at high readiness in the Caribbean, but didn't specify how long that posture can be sustained or what impact it has on other mission requirements. Military analysts note that prolonged deployment in hostile environments create retention problems, with experienced soldiers and officers leaving service rather than facing repeated combat tours. The all-volunteer force depends on reasonable career expectations, and perpetual counterinsurgency deployments break that model. Now, let's touch on what this means for defense spending and the federal budget. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost American taxpayers over $7 trillion, according to Brown University's S Costs of War project. Those figures include direct war costs, veteran health care and disability, homeland security expenses, and interest on borrowing to fund the wars. Venezuela would add hundreds of billions more to that total, with costs accelerating year after year as the occupation drags on. Congress hasn't appropriated money specifically for Venezuela occupation. Every dollar spent on this disaster comes either from emergency supplemental appropriations or from defense budgets that could fund readiness, modernization, and deterrence against peer competitors. Trump's unilateral decision to invade Venezuela just committed the United States to potentially decades of military spending without any congressional debate about priorities or sustainable funding. This situation shines a massive spotlight on the political sustainability of American military interventions. Iraq and Afghanistan both lost public support as casualties mounted and costs exploded with no clear victory in sight. Polling consistently shows Americans want the military focused on direct threats to U.S. security, not nation building in countries that don't want American occupation. Venezuela will follow the same trajectory. Initial support erodes as the situation drags on, casualties accumulate, and billions get spent with nothing to show for. It's bad. The electoral implications are devastating for Republicans. Trump campaigned explicitly against forever wars, against nation building, against exactly the type of open-ended military commitment he just launched in Venezuela. His base voters believed those promises. When American soldiers start coming home in caskets from guerrilla ambushes in Caracas slums, when defense budgets balloon to fund the occupation, when billions go to Venezuela reconstruction while domestic priorities remain unfunded, Trump's base will turn on him. Democrats already have their attack lines ready. They'll argue Trump lied about ending forever wars, that he rushed into an ill-planned invasion without congressional authorization, that he's repeating the mistakes of Iraq and Afghanistan despite clear warnings from military experts, and that he's getting Americans killed for oil company profits while ignoring problems at home. That message will resonate with swing voters who remember the Iraq disaster and don't want another generation of troops trapped in counterinsurgency quagmires. The historical parallels are impossible to ignore. Every president who launched major military interventions that became protracted disasters and paid severe political prices. Lyndon Johnson chose not to run for re-election in 1968 as Vietnam consumed his presidency. George W. Bush left office deeply unpopular after Iraq turned into chaos. Trump could face the same political destruction as Venezuela proves unwinnable. Looking ahead, it's clear that this Venezuela disaster will define Trump's second term. The initial military success of capturing Maduro will be forgotten as insurgent resistance mounts, costs spiral, and casualties accumulate. What started as a demonstration of American military power becomes a demonstration of the limits of that power. Trump wanted to show strength. Instead, he's created conditions for America to repeat its worst foreign policy failures. If the insurgency materializes, as military analysts warn, American forces could face years of grinding counterinsurgency. Warfare in urban jungles and mountainous terrain against enemies who know the ground, have local support or intimidate the population into cooperation, and are willing to sustain casualties indefinitely. The colectivos, guerrillas, and Venezuelan military remnants will conduct IED attacks, ambushes, assassinations, and sabotage operations designed to slowly bleed American forces while preventing any stable governance or reconstruction. The Venezuelan government's anarchization strategy creates a no-win situation for the United States. If American forces crack down hard on insurgents, they kill civilians in the process, create humanitarian disasters, and drive population support toward resistance fighters. If American forces operate with restraint to minimize civilian casualties, insurgents use that restraint to conduct operations with impunity. The population suffers regardless, and resentment toward the American occupation becomes the dominant political force. So here's the deal. Trump thought capturing Maduro was a decisive victory that would end the Venezuela problem. This isn't a military success story that demonstrates American power. It's the opening act of what could become the most disastrous American military intervention since Vietnam, triggered by insufficient planning, unrealistic assumptions about insurgent threats, and complete disregard for the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan. If Venezuelan resistance forces implement their prepared guerrilla warfare plans, then we're basically saying American military superiority doesn't matter against determined insurgents on their home territory, that conventional victories don't translate to stable occupations, and that Trump just walked the United States into another forever war after campaigning against exactly that. That would mean decades of American casualties, trillions in costs, and another generation lost to counterinsurgency. Operations that never achieved their objectives. It's about so much more than just Venezuela. It's about whether the United States learned anything from Iraq and Afghanistan, or whether we're doomed to repeat the same catastrophic mistakes. Whether American political leaders can resist the temptation to believe military power solves complex political problems, and whether democracy survives the blowback when occupations fail and presidents who launched them face accountability. So keep an eye on this. Reports of resistance attacks are emerging. Military analysts are issuing warnings. Congressional hearings are coming. Public opinion polling will track support as costs and casualties mount. This disaster is just beginning. The stakes have never been higher. The warnings from military experts clearer, and the parallels to past American failures more obvious. We're watching in real time as Trump's Venezuela gambit transforms from military operation into guerrilla nightmare. What happens next will determine whether the United States extracts itself before the damage becomes irreparable, or whether Trump's obsession with showing strength traps America in another generation, defining military disaster